Hi y'all, I'm Cash the Composer, and I'm writing a musical about Lavinia Fisher. The legend goes that she was a beautiful white woman living in the South who owned an inn with her husband, John Fisher, and together they plotted to rob and kill their tenants when they were inevitably caught. Lavinia claimed that as a married woman, she couldn't be hanged, so they killed John first. When she went up to the gallows, she wore her wedding gown, pleading with the audience to marry her, to save her life, and when no one took her up on the deal, she announced, "If anyone has a message for the devil, tell me now, for I'll be seeing him shortly," and jumped to her death. But that's not the truth. She wasn't white. She and John weren't legally married. They didn't kill or rob anyone. They weren't hanged separately. She didn't hang in her wedding gown, and those last words, those are up for debate as well. If you want to hear the true story, check out the video I did a few weeks ago with Bruce Orr, author of 6 Miles to Charleston, where we discuss the facts of the case. But the broad strokes are, Lavinia was a black slave and John freed her. They ran the 6 Mile house together outside the city limits in a crime-ridden area. The Governor Gettys wanted their land to sell to the President Monroe for the Navy to make a massive profit. He found a scapegoat in this interracial couple, and a lynch mob illegally trespassed and dragged them into the jail. The sheriff looked the other way and punished the victims, not the mob. After a year passed without the couple being able to pay their taxes, the government was able to seize the land, and as a bonus, they executed the pair very publicly as a deterrent to the masses against interracial relationships. As a bonus, as a warning to anyone else who dared to try to free a black woman, let alone marry her, they executed the pair at the same time in a public park, making it a gruesome spectacle at which the priests in attendance were devastated at the image of their love at its end. Today we're going to look at the legend, every falsehood aspect of it that has arisen through the last 2 centuries, and I'm going to postulate where these various myths originated. Some of them were easy to connect the dots, while others are pure speculation with various options. The point of this is to try to provide some clarity, some perspective, not just for you, my audience, but for myself. Behind each one of these pieces of the legend is a kernel of truth, and that truth may be about Lavinia or how we should look at her. A special thanks to Laura, Bruce, John, Jude, and all of the other amazing people who have helped me in my research here. Y'all are the MVPs. All right, let's get started. But first, I need you guys to go ahead and click on that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on my project as I write the musical based on Lavinia's life and death. I'm nearing the end of my research phase, and I've already begun putting pen to paper and writing the show, and I'm really excited to bring you all along for the ride. So go ahead and subscribe, and you won't miss a thing. First, and most obviously, Lavinia Fisher did not kill anyone. There is no record of her killing anyone anywhere in any court documents, in any news article, nothing for a decade after her execution. The only thing that exists is an article which describes the bodies of 2 people buried in the woods near the house, and we'll get back to that in a bit. But the question is, where did this myth of murder come from? That originated in the work of a Peter Nielsen in his book, 6 Years Residence in America, which would have sat on shelves next to the likes of popular penny dreadfuls. He lived in the States from 1822 to 28, well after the execution of the Fishers. He could not have personally witnessed the execution, so his account is purely based on the testimony of others. And he wrote, "The execution of a white person is of rare occurrence in Charleston. Several cases of this, however, came under my observation in the spring of 1820, one of which excited great interest, being that of a man and his wife for murder and robbery to an unknown but awful extent. These people kept a tavern about 6 miles from Charleston, and in concert with some of their associates, had for years carried on a complete trade of murdering and robbing altogether unheard of, except perhaps in Italy in former times. Numbers of people who had traveled on that road disappeared in a sudden and mysterious manner, but murder will out. A man from the country arrived at this inn one evening, and being rather late for town, put up for the night. Somehow or other he kept awake until midnight, and hearing some discussion carried on by the people of the house, from whom he was separated only by a wooden partition, he listened more attentively, and to his horror and amazement heard them disputing as to the most convenient method in which they should dispatch him. As may be well imagined, he kept very quiet, and hastening on his clothes, contrived to slip out of the window, and without looking after his horse made all possible haste for the city, where he instantly gave notice to the police large, a body of whom went out instantly, but the wretches, having missed their victim and suspecting their danger, were on their guard, and having barricaded their doors and windows, refused to surrender. At last, a party of military had to be sent for when a sort of bombardment commenced. The people of the house fired many shots and yielded only after the house was set on fire. The most of the gang, it was supposed, had made their escape previously. The ladies of Charleston exerted themselves in behalf of the woman, conceiving that the execution of a white female would be a disgrace on the fair sex of Carolina. The governor was beset on every hand with petitions, but wisely contrived to keep himself out of the way of the ladies until the execution was over. On digging around this den of iniquity, a great number of skeletons were found, no doubt the remains of unfortunate travelers. The scorched and blackened walls of the house still remain as a memento to the bypasser. To be fair, this man probably got all of his knowledge here through oral retellings, notoriously unreliable, and this is the case for the majority of the stories he told in his book. And this is a tradition for Lavinia's story and the stories of many like her. The tourism industry is a big thing here in Charleston, and we have lots of history tours and ghost tours. Big shout out to both Bulldog Tours and Ghost City Tours, both of whom have graciously allowed their amazing hosts to be featured on my channel. Y'all are awesome. Anyhow, there's a lot of half-truths, full truths, and complete falsehoods mixed together in this account. But for the moment, let's focus on the murder aspect. Prior to the publication of this work in the year 1830, there was no mention of any killings in any publication that I could find. This is the first, and somehow it became the go-to resource for her story. And it's not hard to see how the conclusion of murder could be had. Peter took the stories he was told and connected the dots. One aspect in particular that was muddled was the tale of the supposed one guest that caught the pair. In fact, there were two men that were associated with the investigation, one David Ross and one John Peoples. According to the court documents, David Ross was a part of the mob that went out to 6 Mile House to try to take out the supposed criminals, serving in a way as their lookout after they had forced everyone in the house to leave their premises. When the residents, John and Lavinia included, returned, Ross claimed to have been attacked, then to have reached out to Lavinia for aid, only to have her smash his head through a window, and then he somehow escaped. Oh, hello, Oz. Yes, I will hold you, my little fuzzy buddy. According to the court documents, John Peoples claimed that he was set upon by the gang that Ross's mob had actually set out to investigate, and claimed that a woman was in that group. He was unable to identify the folks that robbed him initially, but later he was able to pick out 3 faces from a lineup, John and Lavinia Fisher, as well as a man named William Hayward. William Hayward being the caretaker of 5 Mile House. Kind of interesting that the only people he was able to pick out were the property owners. Ah, Governor Geddes, I smell ya. Usually in retellings, Peoples' name is the one that people ascribe to this supposed lucky tenant whose story combines the tales of these 2 witnesses for the prosecution. As far as the escape through the window goes, well, according to the Charleston Courier, in September, about 6 months into their incarceration, John Fisher actually escaped the jail, though Lavinia was unable to follow, through the window. Kind of funny how the story kind of got blended, that the pretender victim has taken on the elements of the story of the actual victim, the supposed aggressor. I mean, you better believe that's going to be a song. Our second myth. Lavinia did not actually poison any of her supposed victims with Oleander Tea. Now, this is one of those myths that I don't have a concrete origin for, but I can provide a little insight into where the myths may have started. As it turns out, oleander, though poisonous, is a flower that is heavily associated with tea. It's actually a standardized teacup shape, one with scalloped sides, a flared lip, and a foot. Apparently it resembles the flower. When I was researching the idea of oleander tea being used to kill, I actually came across another story which bears some striking similarities to Lavinia's. In 1817, a full 2 years prior to the Fisher's arrest, at the Myrtles plantation, supposedly there was a black slave named Chloe who poisoned her master, one Sarah Woodruff, and her children with oleander tea, killing them. And Chloe was hanged for her crimes by her fellow slaves. We'll get back to this in a sec. Now, there's a more local myth pertaining to the use of oleander tea as a poison, and that is in regard to the Civil War. Allegedly, the Low Country ladies would prepare a tea comprised of oleander leaves to serve to the Yankees invading to deal with the armed forces in their own way. I located a book entitled Two Gardeners, a lovely story of the friendship between 2 women told through a series of letters. And in one letter there reads a postscript. Did I ask you if you were reading Children of Pride, the letters of the Jones family of Liberty County, Georgia, before, during, and after the Civil War? Especially interesting to me as all of my father's family were right there in the path of General Sherman's march to the sea. A woman called here the other day to ask the name of a plant with long, narrow leaves and pink flowers that the Confederate soldiers used to poison the stupid Yankees by telling them the leaves made excellent tea. Then she said, "Oh dear, I hope you are not a stupid Yankee." I told her no. It's probably my family who did the poisoning. The plant is oleander. Now, in looking into this book that she references, Children of Pride, I found only one real reference to poisoning, and interestingly, it was regarding poisoning by an overdose of medication. Medicines being poisonous in too large of quantities isn't anything we aren't already used to today. As an example, take chemotherapy. That's designed to try to kill the cancer before it kills you. Anyhow, I looked into this and I discovered an article entitled, and I'm gonna have to look at my notes here, "Can a root doctor actually put a hex on, or is it all a great put on?" by a guy named Mike Michelson in a magazine called Today's Health. A doctor by the nickname of Dr. Bug, which is amazing, real name Peter Murray, dealt with numerous patients with, and I wish I had made this up because it's so great, hippity hoppity heart syndrome. Yeah. And he treated this with a potion comprised of alcohol, mothballs, lead, and oleander leaves. As it turns out, oleander poisoning resembles, and I'm gonna butcher this, I'm sorry, digoxin toxicity, and it is similarly this thing called cardiac glycosides that make it so deadly. As the name implies, they affect the heart. But these same dangerous molecules actually can be used to treat numerous heart disorders. It's not dissimilar to digitalis, aka foxglove, another poison which can be used to treat heart conditions such as heart rhythm problems and congestive heart failure, even in the modern day. Just like this heavily regulated and rigorously tested medication, it's all about finding that balance. But Dr. Bug wasn't perfect, and there were deaths when soldiers were over-medicated. Almost to tie this together in a nice little bow, guess where our lovely Dr. Bug was from? He was from New York, a little town called Olean. That's right, Dr. Bug was himself an oleander. Now let's return to that story at the Myrtles plantation. The truth is, Chloe never existed at all, and Sarah actually died in 1823 from yellow fever, but nonetheless, this myth perpetuates. I won't go into detail on that, that's a whole other tangent, but I will link an article with more info in the description below. Hey buddy. Hey! On top of all of that, I can't find a real verifiable account of a Yankee soldier being poisoned by tea of the oleander plant administered by a Low Country lady, but I have found numerous indicators towards its use as a medication that gave an occasional lethal result. The tie between these two myths is in the racial tension, a slave poisoning her masters, a flower in the enslaved South leading to the deaths of Yankee soldiers. Ah! Now, there are two surviving verifiable accounts of the executions of Lavinia and John Fisher. Both of these are accompanied by lengthy, and I do mean lengthy, essays on the dangers of the use of capital punishment, especially in its use as a deterrent to the masses. Now, highway robbery is a crime, but they were only convicted of stealing between $30 and $40, which is less than $1,000 in today's money. Not even enough to bring you past small claims court, hardly enough to warrant the spectacle of their execution. And they were also hanged separately from their supposed co-conspirator, William Hayward, so clearly there was something special, something different about these two. What made them so special? What was it that warranted a grand hanging in a public square rather than the usual gallows just outside the jail? I believe that they were indeed meant to serve as a deterrent to the masses, not against murder or robbery or anything of that nature, but for the crime of their interracial relationship. A white man and a black woman, and their love. There's not a lot out there for me to definitively prove this, but my belief is that given that Lavinia didn't kill a single soul, the details of her killings had to be borrowed from somewhere. The tale of the black woman taking revenge on her masters mixed with the Charlestonian tales of Oleander Tea poisoning the foreign travelers, yeah, I could easily create the story as we know it today. On to our third myth, and perhaps my favorite one to chat about, and that is the detail of the corpses being sent via trapdoor down a chute to the basement. This one is really easy to refute, as we live in Charleston. With low elevation and a close proximity to the sea, we have no basements here. So the question is, where did this particular myth originate? Now, I have 3 theories, and it all depends on when this myth started. Now, the earliest recollection of this that I can find is in 1897, and we'll get to that later, so I began my search from the 1890s backwards. My first theory is in regards to a man that many state was the first serial killer in America, none other than H.H. Holmes, convicted in the 1890s. He built a literal murder hotel featuring a number of trapdoors, among other horrible, horrible things. Doing exactly what the people say the Fishers did, again, in addition to other horrible, horrible things. Just like with the Oleander Tea, it isn't beyond the realm of reason to suspect that elements of his story were borrowed for Lavinia's to fill in the blanks left by Nielsen's exaggerations, especially given that, just like her, he ran a hotel. My second theory references the first serial killing family in America in the 1870s, going back a little further, the Bloody Benders. While they didn't run a hotel per se, they did host travelers quite frequently at their home, and they actually built a trapdoor underneath the bed meant for the guests where they would be dropped down to their deaths. When police investigated, they found a terrible stench and a mess of dried blood on the floor beneath the trapdoor. Given the similarities in this tale, it's not hard to see the connection here. Finally, my third and favorite theory is in regards to a tale told far closer to the advent of Lavinia's original story, specifically a penny dreadful released in 1846, just shy of 2 decades past Nielsen's tale, which would have still been on the shelves at that time, reaching similar audiences as it was continually republished until Nielsen's death in the 1860s. Anyways, this particular penny dreadful talked about a man and a woman owning a business together, wherein the woman would feed their guests things that they did not expect, and the man would kill the guests, sending them down a trapdoor to the basement to be formally dispatched. This penny dreadful was entitled The String of Pearls, now known more commonly by its musical adaptation, Sweeney Todd. If someone ever makes a drinking game based on my channel, make sure that one of the things is take a shot every time she mentions Sweeney Todd, because I feel like I've talked about it quite a bit here. Anyways, whether it's from H.H. Holmes, the Bloody Benders, or from Sweeney Todd, it's very clearly evident that the idea of a trapdoor leading guests to their doom was not original and common enough to be sucked into Lavinia's story. Our fourth myth is that the legend claims that dozens or even hundreds of bodies were found buried on the site of the 6 Mile House. This clearly originates with Nielsen's account. However, the truth is that the coroner's report in the Charleston Chronicle on February 26, 1819 detailed only 2 graves, 200 yards from the house on the edge of the woods, that of a white man, freshly buried, and a black woman a few years previous. I believe that this black woman was Lavinia's sister, one Sally Fisher, also sold into slavery to Charleston in the same bill of sale. They were sold again to an unnamed party, presumably John, granting their freedom together, and there's no trace of either beyond that point. If Sally died, she would not have been allowed to be buried in a church graveyard as a black woman, so it makes sense for Lavinia to have given her sister a grave as best she could. The white man was likely one of the actual robbers, a member of the actual gang, or perhaps a member of the mob that harassed the Fishers. Either way, his death cannot be attributed to malice given the violent nature of the mob that attacked the 6 Mile House. It's likely that he just died in the crossfire, and either the mob haphazardly buried him at that site, or more likely, the Fishers took pity and gave him his last rites at the same site as Lavinia's sister. In reality, what likely happened is that Nielsen heard the plural bodies and ran with it. As an example of this, if I tell you I know a couple of stained glass makers, do I know a few people who make stained glass, or do I know a married couple that makes stained glass together? Or if I say, I ate some eggs this morning, am I saying that I ate 2 fried eggs, or am I saying I made an omelet out of 2 dozen eggs a la Gaston in Beauty and the Beast? And as a final example, if I say I tripped and fell down the stairs, am I talking about the stadium of the Super Bowl, or am I talking about the front steps of my house? You see, this is a failing of the English language and many other languages like it, a lack of specificity in our words and phrasing, which can lead to vastly different interpretations of the same statements. When I say that they found bodies on the land of the Fishers, that could mean anywhere from 2 to infinity. Fifth, let's talk about those famous last words. These originally seem to have originated in a document entitled A Day on the Cooper River by John Beaufane Irving, published in 1842, later released and re-edited by Louisa Chavis Stoney in 1932. This document, by the way, is one of the first to discuss the three above-mentioned aspects of the legend: the poison, the trapdoor, and the many non-existent bodies. In the final paragraph, they mention a minister, one Mr. Galuchat of the Methodist Episcopal Church. On the gallows, Lavinia shrieked in spite of her husband's efforts. Another minister, Mr. Galuchat, approached her. She said clearly, "Cease, I will have none of it. Save your words for others that want them. But if you have a message you want to send to hell, give it to me, I will carry it." At this minute, a paper in the sheriff's hand renewed her hope of a reprieve, but he told her she must die. And then the poor woman prayed to heaven for mercy on her soul. Now, we could go with the technicality, oh, apparently she prayed after those last words, but that's not how I do things. I wanna be more definitive in my rulings here. Given that this document already contains a number of falsifications, I looked into this book, and it turns out that this story did not exist in the 1842 edition of the book. That edition is available for free on the Internet Archive and Google Books. Such commentary was actually added by Stoney over a century after the events of the Fishers in 1932. It cannot be considered a primary source. While Beatrice St. Julian Ravenel references this in her book Charleston Murders, and she believes it to be truthful, I don't believe that to be the case. The earliest actual mention of these words that I've been able to find was in 1897, when a number of papers ran an article on the anniversary of Lavinia's death. In these articles, all of these details in the Stoney Irving account are expounded upon, and Galuchat is named for the first time. There are additional details, such as the mention of several women fighting on Lavinia's behalf, which I have not been able to verify at all. Oddly enough, though, Galuchat and all of these women are verifiably citizens of Charleston at the time of the execution, so it is conceivable that they were somehow involved in everything. Even more interestingly still, all of these people were involved in the Methodist Church, and the final woman mentioned was apparently the grandmother of the writer of the article, the main source of the tale contained within the article. So, is it a stretch to think that Grandma maybe told a couple of exaggerated tall tales about how she tried so desperately to save the poor woman who was hanged? I don't think so. An interesting fact about Galuchat, by the way, that is not at all related, but I think it's worth noting here. He lived right across the street from a significant historical figure, one Denmark Vesey, a free black man whose life and death marked a significant advancement in the civil rights movement. I highly recommend looking up his story. All right, on to our sixth. We have the idea that Lavinia was hanged in her wedding dress. Now, this is very easy to refute. It's easy to verify that immediately after the mob arrested Lavinia and John, they razed 6 Mile House to the ground. Last I checked, almost every type of fabric is extremely flammable. And even if they had gotten married in a proper ceremony with a proper white dress, which they couldn't as an interracial couple, as previously mentioned, and I have triple checked the records in both Charleston County and Rowan County, North Carolina, just to make sure that proper dress would have gone up in smoke with the rest of their belongings when it was burned down. Tracing the origin of this is actually pretty easy. They were hanged wearing white clothes that they had purchased, as noted in the essay by attorney John Blake White. Well, when we hear that a woman was hanged in white, it's very easy to see how that could get twisted into a white wedding gown, similar to the other misunderstandings shown by Nielsen. Additionally, it's important to note that the idea that they were hanged in white could very easily have been switched around, such that people now mistakenly believe Lavinia to have been white. Just another thing to note here. All right, on to our seventh. The idea that a woman could not be hanged. First off, there's not, and there never has been, a law in Charleston or in South Carolina as a whole against the execution of a married woman, a white woman, a woman of childbearing age, none of that. You have no idea how boring reading through old laws is, guys. Oh my God. Glad we got that out of the way. There was a petition to the governor for a stay of execution prior to the planned date of February 4th, 1819, and that caused their execution to be delayed until February 18th. 1819. This petition was, according to the letter written by G.S., we'll come back to him in a bit, in the Nathaniel Coverley pamphlet, due to the confession of some other character to the crimes of which the Fishers were accused. However, others have claimed, as in that article in 1897, that it was because a married woman should not be hanged. I believe that this myth originated with the oral retellings by the women of Charleston, as above, who wanted to claim that they had done something to try to save this poor woman, when in reality they stood idly by. Because, you see, there's nothing out there in the letters of Matilda Whiteman, Magdalene Brown, Selena Smith, nor anyone else trying to save Lavinia's life. Bystander effect is a hell of a thing, y'all. If nothing else, the paper in the sheriff's hands that gave Lavinia hope for a reprieve, that White and GS both mention in their accounts of the execution as well. It may have been a potential origin for this aspect of the story, but I digress. 8th, let's talk about the confusion of the order of the execution. Many retellings of the story have Lavinia hanged after John to combat the supposed married women cannot be hanged law, but in both actual eyewitness accounts and in the papers that reported after the execution, as well as in pretty much every hanging with multiple bodies, they were hanged simultaneously. Additionally, many claim that she jumped to her death. Some say she hung silently, some say she thrashed about violently, but the truth is she just snapped her neck when she dropped, just like everybody else. So, where did this come from? That story told in the 1897 article, the oral retellings from the folks who swore they were there, the bastardization resulting from the original article published the day of their deaths, wherein Reverend Furman painted a very oppositional picture of Lavinia versus his much more merciful picture of John, that she fought back when he showed repentance. All of these contributed to the separation of John versus Lavinia. We'll talk a little bit more about that Reverend Furman biz a little later. 9th, there's this myth that comes out of left field, which is that her ghost haunts the Unitarian Church. This is born from the idea that she was buried in their graveyard, and this is not so. As it happens, she was buried in a potter's field beneath what is now the Medical University of South Carolina. So we have to look at this from two angles. First, what actually happened to her body, and second, why the Unitarian Church? I've said it before and I'll say it again, Lavinia was a black woman. Today, in the year 2024, women do not have rights to their bodies. Black women even less so. A lot of research shows that women of color get less attention and worse care than white women when dealing with the same issues. And no, I'm not even talking about those controversial topics that just came to mind. I'm talking about things like the fact that at teaching hospitals, medical students can perform pelvic exams on patients undergoing general anesthesia without the patient's consent or even their knowledge. Yeah, that's fucked up. That's why last year, when I literally snapped my left leg in half completely, I insisted on going to Roper Hospital rather than MUSC. I didn't want my bodily autonomy violated without my consent on literally one of the worst days of my entire life. And MUSC is exactly the problem. Prior to its current incarnation, there was the SCMC, the South Carolina Medical College. This was an institution under the Medical Society of South Carolina. According to my friend Carolyn Kane, her ancestor who worked at SCMC dug up Lavinia's remains and brought her skull to the college to be studied. Soon enough, it was put up on display hanging in the Charleston Museum, connected to the SCMC. Eventually, it was taken down and returned to Carolyn's family, where it is now to this day. The question everybody always asks is, how would they have known which body was Lavinia's? And also, why would the medical institution have said yes to this whole morbid thing? Well, have I got some disturbing news for you. Turns out both of those questions have the same answer. Remember that bill of sale that I mentioned earlier? A Colonel George Fisher, John's uncle, sold Lavinia and her sister Sally to one Joseph Glover of Charleston. Glover was a physician. He was apparently a pretty good one. Good enough to be the Surgeon General of South Carolina in 1819 through 1824. And he was respected enough to be elected president of the Medical Society of South Carolina. Do you see where this is going, or do I need to spell it out for you? Glover felt entitled to Lavinia's body and life. Naturally, he felt just as entitled to it in death. He would have been the head of everything in 1820, and it would have been him who gave the final yes for Lavinia to be exhumed, beheaded, studied, hanged, displayed, and he, of all people, would have known exactly what she looked like. Listen, y'all, as an aside, I know a lot of the folks who work at MUSC, and I really respect what you guys do. But we have to recognize that there's an entrenched darkness in the history of the medical profession, especially in the treatment of women. I am not decrying any living person at MUSC. All I am asking in this moment right now is that y'all do your damnedest to make sure that people's body and autonomy are respected and get the care that they ask for and deserve regardless of sex, age, race, anything else. And I know, because of my friendships with many of you out there, that you already do, and your efforts are changing the medical field for the better, and I want to thank you for that. All right, back to talking about ghost stories. On the other side of the coin, we have the interest of the Unitarian Church. So far, we've had a Baptist in Richard Furman, a Methodist in Joseph Gallichat, but neither is connected to the Unitarian Church. So if you look at the leadership of the Unitarian Church at that time, you'll see that the newly ordained reverend was a man by the name of Samuel Gilman. Now, Gilman was a nice boy from Massachusetts and was ordained just a few months prior to the Fisher's execution, and as the clergy all tended to be in attendance at these things, it would have been his very first to witness, and he would have been right by the gallows, no one closer except the attorneys, the sheriff, and the executioner. Nathaniel Coverley published a pamphlet shortly after the execution, as I mentioned previously, decrying the use of capital punishment, using the Fishers as the primary example of its dangers. It holds within it a first-person eyewitness account by an anonymous source, and we only have a few clues to the identity of this person. 1, that he was very close to the gallows. 2, that he wrote this letter to a friend back in Boston. And 3, that he signed his letters G. Line S. Dot. All hold true for our friend here, Samuel Gilman. I believe that this is where the connection to the Unitarian Church originates, in the presence of Gilman at the execution and how it must have affected him, as stated so much in his sorrowful letter. 10th and finally, there is the myth that this picture is a picture of Lavinia Fisher, or that this picture is a picture of Lavinia Fisher. Neither one is a picture of Lavinia Fisher. This first one is a woman named Kitty Fisher, painted by Joshua Reynolds in 1763. Catherine Maria Fisher was born in 1741 and died in 1767, and she was a British courtesan, which is essentially the equivalent of a modern-day influencer. She never set foot in America, and she certainly never got hanged at the gallows. The second one is a photograph, and I'm not quite sure of whom, but it doesn't matter because it's definitely not Lavinia, as the daguerreotype photographic process was brought to the USA in 1839, nearly 2 decades after Lavinia's death. There's no way a photograph could exist of her, as she was rotting away at that point. As an extension of the myth of the pictures that I've shown here, my final debunking and origin story is of the myth that Lavinia was white. First, as mentioned previously, we have that bill of sale regarding Lavinia Fisher naming her as a Negro woman. Second, she was described in the court documents as Amazonian, a term which at the time referred to her temperament as angry, aggressive, those kinds of words that are too often applied to black women purely for their existence as black women, even today. Third, she was only ever otherwise described as strangely beautiful, a descriptor that warrants a second look, because of course racist people would think it's strange to consider a black woman beautiful. Fourth, I went and visited Lavinia and her skull's caretaker, and I brought images and measurements of the skull to a forensic artist who, based on these numerous images and plentiful measurements, believes that skull to be of a woman of African descent, and the sketch certainly seems to support that theory. Fifth, and perhaps most damningly of all, Reverend Furman was the person who gave the account to the newspapers in their many articles after the execution, and he spent a lot of his time talking about John, referring to him as sincere, humbling, affectionate, and then referring to Lavinia, whom he neglected to minister to, by the way, as under wrong passions and feelings. Now, I like to refer to Reverend Furman as Reverend Racist, given that he literally wrote the book on the defense of slavery used from its release in 1822 until the Civil War, the exposition of the views of the Baptists relative to the colored population of the United States. It's not hard to understand why this racist son of a bitch would have dismissed and rejected Lavinia. He believed that slavery was ethically ordained by God. Of course, he would think that this black woman deserved to be hanged. Suffice it to say, Lavinia was black. I've already mentioned where the thought that she was white could have come from, the white clothes mentioned by John Blake White, but most obviously it came from what I like to call default setting syndrome. There's probably a better name for it, but that's what I call it. Because we've been trained by society to do so, we go in assuming that the default is straight, white, and male. Anything else has to be specified. When I talk about my work as a composer, I don't get to just talk about my work as a composer. I have to talk about my work as a female composer. When tour guides talk about the myth of Lavinia Fisher, proclaiming her to be a serial killer, they don't get to talk about her as the first serial killer in America, even though she predated H.H. Holmes by many decades. No, they specifically refer to her as the first female serial killer in America. So yeah, default setting syndrome. You have to specify if the person isn't straight, white, or male. So it's not hard to see that since in all of this documentation that was publicly viewed, i.e. the newspapers of the time, they didn't state Lavinia's race, since it would have been obvious to the contemporaries who saw her either working at the 6 Mile house or at her trial or even at her execution. People assumed the default that she was white. That's what happens when society's super racist, y'all. Whew. I think that's about it. Now, a final disclaimer. I'm not an expert, I'm not a historian, I'm a musician. And that's about it. I may have messed up some stuff in here, and this is just my best approximation of where these myths originated. If you know something I don't, please give me your sources in the comments below so I can update my research. Having an open mind is essential to being a good writer. I'll see you all again in 2 weeks. For now, go ahead and check out the video I did with Laura of Ghost City Tours to hear a full retelling of Lavinia's legend, and follow that up with the video I did with Bruce of Lost in Legend and Bulldog Tours, covering the historical facts. Bye for now. Say bye-bye, guys. Bye.